Arrogant rookie officer challenges black judge. What she reveals leaves him speechless. The courtroom buzzed with the quiet murmur of anticipation, a charged stillness settling over the gathered spectators. Judge Regina Fowler, a pillar of quiet authority, adjusted her glasses and glanced at the docket. Another Monday, another set of routine cases, until the doors swung open with a deliberate creak. In walked Officer Dylan Kane, fresh out of the academy, his uniform pristine, his stride laced with self-assurance. The confidence in his eyes was unmistakable, bordering on arrogance. He was here to prove a point. Judge Fowler barely raised an eyebrow, but inwardly, she recognized the type. A young officer, eager to assert dominance, yet blind to the weight of true justice. Kane's case, an excessive force accusation, was nothing extraordinary. But the way he carried himself, smirking as if already victorious, set something uneasy in motion. As he took his place at the defendant's table, he met the judge's gaze, unflinching. His attorney whispered something to him, but he barely acknowledged it. Judge Fowler tapped her gavel lightly, her voice steady and authoritative. "Officer Kane, this is a courtroom, not a proving ground. Let's see if you understand the difference." Judge Regina Fowler had spent over 2 decades presiding over cases that tested both the law and her patience. She had seen it all: defendants who wept in remorse, lawyers who twisted facts into pretzels, and officers who believed their badge put them above scrutiny. Her reputation was built on a foundation of fairness and sharp intellect. She never raised her voice, she never needed to. A simple look, a precisely timed pause, and the weight of her words did more than any display of dominance ever could. Her rulings were respected because they were rooted in law, but also in an unwavering moral compass that many found unshakable. Dylan Kane, on the other hand, was the embodiment of unchecked confidence. Just 24, he had barely stepped off the academy grounds before finding himself at the center of controversy. He had aced his training, excelled in marksmanship, and was a natural leader, or so he believed. He saw himself as a warrior for law and order, a soldier in the fight against chaos. But the lesson that power required restraint had yet to fully sink in. He had never been questioned like this before. Throughout training, he had been praised, not scrutinized. The idea that his actions might be subject to criticism was foreign to him. And the notion that a judge, particularly this judge, could hold his career in her hands had yet to dawn on him. The courtroom, however, was not the streets. And as much as Kane believed he was here to teach a lesson, it was he who was about to be schooled. Judge Regina Fowler had spent over 2 decades presiding over cases that tested both the law and her patience. She had seen it all: defendants who wept in remorse, lawyers who twisted facts into pretzels, and officers who believed their badge put them above scrutiny. Her reputation was built on a foundation of fairness and sharp intellect. She never raised her voice, she never needed to. A simple look, a precisely timed pause, and the weight of her words did more than any display of dominance ever could. Her rulings were respected because they were rooted in law, but also in an unwavering moral compass that many found unshakable. Dylan Kane, on the other hand, was the embodiment of unchecked confidence. Just 24, he had barely stepped off the academy grounds before finding himself at the center of controversy. He had aced his training, excelled in marksmanship, and was a natural leader, or so he believed. He saw himself as a warrior for law and order, a soldier in the fight against chaos. But the lesson that power required restraint had yet to fully sink in. He had never been questioned like this before. Throughout training, he had been praised, not scrutinized. The idea that his actions might be subject to criticism was foreign to him. And the notion that a judge, particularly this judge, could hold his career in her hands had yet to dawn on him. The courtroom, however, was not the streets. And as much as Kane believed he was here to teach a lesson, it was he who was about to be schooled. The tension in the courtroom thickened as the bailiff called Officer Dylan Kane's name. He stood, adjusting his uniform, his expression unreadable save for the lingering smirk at the corner of his mouth. Judge Regina Fowler watched him approach the stand with measured patience, her fingers steepled as she observed his every move. The prosecutor, an older man with a steady voice, laid out the case against Kane: excessive force during an arrest, a charge supported by both body camera footage and witness testimony. The allegations weren't damning enough to end his career, but they were serious enough to warrant scrutiny. Kane, undeterred, leaned into the microphone. "Your Honor, I did what I was trained to do. Sometimes situations escalate, and officers have to make split-second decisions." Judge Fowler nodded, her expression unreadable. "And do you believe that decision-making is exempt from accountability?" Kane hesitated, just briefly. "No, Your Honor. But I believe in upholding the law and maintaining order." "Maintaining order," Judge Fowler repeated, tapping her gavel lightly. "Interesting choice of words. What does maintaining order mean to you, Officer Kane?" The rookie officer straightened his posture. "It means ensuring the safety of the public, preventing threats before they escalate." The judge let a pause settle in before responding. "Does preventing threats include using force on an individual who was already restrained?" A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Kane's jaw tightened. His attorney leaned in, whispering a warning, but Kane brushed it off. "With respect, Your Honor, I made a judgment call," he said, his voice firmer. "I was in control of the situation." Judge Fowler's sharp gaze didn't waver. "Control. Another interesting choice of words." She turned her attention to the prosecutor. "Let's review the footage." The court's attention shifted to the screen as the footage played. Kane's voice echoed through the speakers, sharp and commanding. The suspect, a young man accused of shoplifting, appeared compliant, his hands raised as he stood beside the patrol car. The moment that sealed the case, however, came seconds later. Kane, without further provocation, forced the suspect to the ground with a swift and unnecessary maneuver. The courtroom was silent as the footage ended. Kane's smirk faltered for the first time. Judge Fowler leaned forward. "Officer Kane, explain to this court why you felt it was necessary to escalate that situation." Kane swallowed, his confidence dimming just a fraction. "He was resisting, Your Honor." "Resisting?" The judge arched a brow. "Because he turned his head to speak?" Kane didn't answer immediately. His silence spoke louder than any justification he could have given. "This court is here to determine whether your judgment was justified," Judge Fowler continued. "And from what I have seen so far, your version of events does not align with the evidence." The weight of her words settled over the room, the once cocky rookie officer now faced with something he hadn't anticipated: accountability. The silence in the courtroom lingered for a moment after Judge Fowler's words. The weight of accountability, a foreign force to Officer Dylan Kane, pressed against him. His once certain gaze faltered, but he quickly masked it with a deep breath and straightened his shoulders. He wasn't about to let a judge, especially one he viewed as soft on crime, undermine him. The prosecutor stepped forward. "Officer Kane, the footage we just witnessed shows the suspect in a non-threatening posture. His hands were visible, and he was in the process of complying. Can you explain why you felt the need to use force?" Kane's attorney shifted beside him, signaling for restraint, but Kane leaned forward. "Suspects can be unpredictable. He could have been preparing to flee or attack." Judge Fowler rested her chin on her hand, scrutinizing him. "And yet, at no point in the footage does he make any sudden movements. If he was preparing to flee, why did he keep his hands raised? Why was there no sign of aggression?" Kane exhaled sharply. "Split-second decisions don't always look perfect in hindsight." The judge nodded. "Indeed, but law enforcement is not about hindsight, it is about sound judgment in the moment. A badge does not grant the right to act on instinct alone. It requires discernment." Kane's jaw tightened. The gallery stirred, sensing his frustration. The prosecutor continued. "Your Honor, I would like to present the witness testimonies." A middle-aged man in a gray suit stepped forward. "Your Honor, I was across the street when the incident happened. The suspect was scared, but he wasn't resisting. He kept saying he didn't want trouble. I remember thinking the officer seemed overly aggressive for a simple shoplifting case." Kane scoffed under his breath. "Another armchair expert," he muttered, but Judge Fowler's sharp glance silenced him. The next witness, A woman in her 30s took the stand. "I was recording on my phone," she said, gripping the stand. "When I saw the officer throw him down, I remember gasping. It wasn't necessary. He didn't fight back. He was just a kid." The video from her phone played next. It was from a different angle than the body camera footage. It captured Kane's sharp shove, the suspect's stunned expression, the audible crack of him hitting the pavement. A murmur swept through the courtroom. Judge Fowler leaned forward, her voice softer now, but no less piercing. "Officer Kane, do you understand why this case is being scrutinized so closely?" Kane remained silent. She continued, "This isn't just about one incident. This is about trust. Law enforcement only functions when the public believes that force is used responsibly. What I see in this footage is an abuse of that trust." Kane clenched his fists. "With respect, Your Honor, people don't understand what it's like in the field. Officers don't have the luxury of slowing down and debating options." Judge Fowler's expression didn't waver. "And yet, the best officers do precisely that. They evaluate. They de-escalate. They prioritize restraint." Kane's attorney stood. "Your Honor, I'd like to remind the court that my client has an exemplary record. This is his first accusation of misconduct." Judge Fowler nodded. "A clean record does not exempt one from scrutiny." She turned to Kane. "Tell me, officer, do you believe your actions that day reflect the standards of your profession?" Kane hesitated, his bravado cracking. The courtroom awaited his answer, but the weight of the truth was finally pressing in. The courtroom held its breath as Officer Dylan Kane struggled to formulate a response. His once unwavering confidence had taken its first serious blow. The weight of the judge's words, the irrefutable evidence, and the murmurs from the gallery pressed in on him. Judge Fowler allowed the silence to stretch, letting the tension settle before she spoke again. "Officer Kane, I will ask you one final time. Do you believe your actions that day reflect the standards expected of your profession?" Kane clenched his jaw. His attorney leaned in, whispering something in a measured tone, but Kane waved him off. "I did what I had to do," he said, his voice quieter now, but still carrying an edge of defiance. "I followed my instincts." The prosecutor took a step forward, adjusting his glasses. "Your instincts, Officer Kane, led to unnecessary force being used on a compliant suspect. Would you say that's a fair summary?" Kane shifted uncomfortably but refused to answer. Judge Fowler's gaze sharpened. "Instinct is not a justification for breaking protocol. The law demands discipline, not unchecked impulse." Kane exhaled sharply, his frustration clear. "Respectfully, Your Honor, officers are forced to make split-second decisions. We don't always have the luxury of standing back and debating what's right in the moment." The judge didn't blink. "And yet, true professionals do exactly that, Officer Kane. The best officers, the ones who lead by example, don't default to force. They assess, they adapt, and they prioritize de-escalation. You had control of that situation, and you escalated it. Why?" Kane had no answer. The prosecutor continued. "Let's revisit the evidence. We've seen the body cam footage, but I'd like to call forward another witness." The door at the back of the courtroom opened, and the victim entered. A young man in his early 20s, his arms still in a sling from the incident. He walked hesitantly to the witness stand, his eyes flicking toward Kane, then quickly away. The prosecutor approached. "Please state your name for the record." "Jason Rivera," the young man said, voice subdued. "Mr. Rivera, can you describe what happened the day of your arrest?" Jason took a breath. I was scared. I know I shouldn't have taken that candy bar, but when the officer stopped me, I did what he said. I raised my hands. I didn't try to run. I told him I was sorry. Next thing I knew, I was on the ground, and my shoulder." He broke off, looking away. The courtroom murmured. The prosecutor nodded. "So you complied?" Jason nodded. "Yes. I was scared, but I wasn't fighting back." Judge Fowler turned back to Kane. "Officer, do you wish to challenge Mr. Rivera's testimony?" Kane hesitated. His hands, which had been resting tensely on the table, clenched. He opened his mouth, but his words faltered. He looked at Jason, then at the judge, and something in his expression wavered. He hesitated, his voice now uncertain. I thought I was doing the right thing. Judge Fowler let the moment sit. Then she spoke, her voice steady. Thinking you are right does not mean you are just. Your duty is to uphold the law with fairness, Officer Kane. And today, this court will determine if you failed in that duty. The air in the courtroom felt heavier than ever. The moment of reckoning had arrived. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as Judge Fowler let Officer Kane's last words settle over the room. The gallery remained hushed, hanging on the weight of the moment. Kane's once unwavering confidence had eroded into something else, something unsure, something vulnerable. The prosecutor cleared his throat and approached the stand. Officer Kane, you say you thought you were doing the right thing, he said evenly. But now that you've seen the footage, heard the testimonies, and felt the weight of these proceedings, do you still believe that? Kane swallowed, his fingers gripping the edge of the table. He hesitated just long enough for the silence to stretch uncomfortably. His attorney leaned in once more, whispering urgently, but Kane barely acknowledged him. Judge Fowler leaned forward. Officer Kane, I suggest you consider your answer carefully. This is not just about your actions that day. It is about your understanding of the responsibility you carry every time you wear that uniform. The officer exhaled sharply. I didn't think it would escalate like that, he admitted. I reacted too quickly. A murmur rippled through the gallery. The prosecutor seized the moment. So you admit your response was excessive? Kane's jaw clenched. He exhaled again, his posture deflating just slightly. I see now that I could have handled it differently. Judge Fowler's expression remained unreadable, though something softened around the edges. Could have? Or should have? Kane met her gaze, and for the first time, the fight drained from his eyes. I should have. The tension in the room shifted. The prosecutor took a step back, nodding. Your Honor, I believe we have everything we need. Judge Fowler turned to the defense. Counsel, do you have anything further? Kane's attorney sighed, rubbing a hand down his face before shaking his head. No, Your Honor. The judge nodded. Very well. Officer Kane, this court is prepared to deliver a ruling. Before I proceed, do you have any final words? Kane hesitated, then slowly shook his head. No, Your Honor. Judge Fowler surveyed the courtroom. Then let us conclude these proceedings. The entire room braced for what was to come next. Judge Fowler took a measured breath before speaking, her voice firm yet composed. Officer Kane, this court has reviewed the evidence thoroughly. The footage, the testimonies, and your own words paint a troubling picture. While no one denies that law enforcement officers face difficult and unpredictable situations, it is their duty to exercise sound judgment and restraint. In this instance, you failed. Kane's hands clenched at his sides, but he remained silent. His earlier bravado was gone, replaced by something more subdued, perhaps even remorse. The judge continued. Excessive force is not merely a lapse in judgment, it erodes the trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve. This court does not take such matters lightly. After reviewing all pertinent details, I have determined the following. The gallery leaned in, the anticipation thick in the air. Officer Dylan Kane, you are hereby suspended from active duty for 6 months, required to undergo mandatory de-escalation training, and will be placed under supervisory evaluation upon reinstatement. Furthermore, you will issue a formal, public apology to the victim, Jason Rivera. This is not simply about punishment, it is an opportunity to recognize and correct the actions that brought us here today. A wave of murmurs swept through the courtroom. Kane's attorney placed a hand on his shoulder, but Kane barely reacted. His eyes flicked toward Jason Rivera, who sat stiffly in the gallery. Their gazes met for the briefest moment, Kane's unreadable, Jason's wary but resolute. Judge Fowler's voice cut through the noise. Officer Kane, do you understand the terms of this ruling? Kane exhaled slowly before nodding. Yes, Your Honor. Fowler's eyes remained on him. Good. Because let me be clear, this courtroom is not just a place of judgment, it is a place of learning. What you do with this experience will determine what kind of officer, and what kind of man, you choose to become. The gavel struck, and the case was closed. Kane remained seated for a moment, absorbing the weight of the moment, as the gallery began to disperse. He had come into the courtroom expecting to win, but he was leaving with something far heavier: accountability. As the courtroom emptied, Officer Dylan Kane remained seated, his shoulders slightly hunched, his mind racing through everything that had transpired. The gavel's final strike still echoed in his ears, but the weight of Judge Fowler's words pressed even heavier on his conscience. He had walked into this courtroom certain of his righteousness, assured that his actions were beyond reproach. Now, he wasn't so sure. The evidence, the testimonies, and perhaps most of all, the quiet, unwavering resolve of Jason Rivera had stripped away his confidence. For the first time, he was forced to confront a reality he had refused to acknowledge: he had abused his authority. Jason stood near the exit, speaking in hushed tones with his attorney. Kane hesitated, then, before he could second-guess himself, he stood and made his way toward the young man. Rivera noticed him approaching, his posture stiffening instinctively. Kane stopped a few feet away, hands at his sides. Kane cleared his throat, trying to find the right words. He exhaled sharply, then finally spoke. I'm sorry. Rivera studied him for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. He didn't say anything, but something in his expression softened. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was acknowledgement. Kane turned and walked out of the courtroom, the crisp air outside feeling different somehow. Lighter yet heavier. He had been given a second chance, but he knew it was up to him to make it mean something. Judge Fowler watched from the bench as he left. She had seen many officers pass through her courtroom, some stubborn, some broken, some irredeemable. But she sensed that Kane still had a choice, one that would define the rest of his career. Whether he learned from this moment or not would be entirely up to him. As she gathered her papers, she allowed herself a rare, small smile. Justice had been served today, not just in the letter of the law, but in the possibility of change. And that, she knew, was the kind of verdict that mattered most. If this story about justice and accountability resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Stay tuned for more thought-provoking stories that challenge perspectives and explore the complexities of law, power, and integrity. Join the conversation. What are your thoughts on the verdict? We want to hear from you. Do you believe Officer Kane's punishment was fair? What would you have done in Judge Fowler's position? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and engage with others in this crucial discussion on justice and responsibility. Did you catch all the key moments leading to Kane's realization? What part of the story impacted you the most? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss another compelling courtroom drama.